How do we talk about politics and religion without killing each other? That's the name of a podcast. It's actually called Talkin, Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. And we're going to be talking with the host of that show, Corey Nathan, all about faith, politics, and his journey from Judaism into Christianity. That and more on today's Higher Ground with Billy Hollowell. With no further ado, let's dive right into this conversation that will help us hopefully navigate the chaos coming here in 2024 politically, socially, and let's face it, pretty much on every plane imaginable. Here is Corey Nathan. Corey, we've got a lot to talk about, especially in this contentious, and I think it's going to be probably the worst election year we've seen yet when it comes to a variety of factors, but in particular, the way people communicate and speak to one another. You have a podcast, Talkin Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, which I love that name and that title. What was it that led you to dive into this particular podcast project?
First of all, props to you, Billy, because you got the Talkin and the Killin without the G's on the end. So you passed the first test. So what was it? You know, it was something that I detected very early on after I became a Christian in the early 2000s, that we have a tendency to otherize people and generalize people. And it was creating obstacles for us to be able to talk to each other across our differences. Oh, you're talking to them. Quick story. Very early on when I was a Christian, I developed a great friendship with the main teaching pastor at our church, Pastor Tom Givens. And I said, it was 2004. I said, Pastor Tom, I don't know if this was a church that we had about 2,000 or 3,000 people that showed up on any given weekend. I said, Pastor Tom, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a John Edwards bumper sticker out in the park on one of the cars in the parking lot. And, we had already started talking about politics, but he said, Corey, you're joking around about that, but I've received dozens of emails saying, Pastor Tom, what are we going to do about this? As if having somebody that supported somebody with a D before their name was such a calamity that we'd have to do something about it. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that obviously some folks might not know my story that are listening, but I grew up very observantly Jewish before I became a Christian. So, when I became a Christian, that meant that I had to go home and have a really fraught conversation with my family, my father in particular. And
how did that conversation go?
Oh, it went great. He was like, oh, that's fantastic. Let's have some tuna fish and call it a day. No, it was not very good. It was very fraught. In fact, for at least 3 or 4 years, I was studying apologetics just to figure out how to be better able to have this conversation. I've evolved, if you will, from there because I found apologetics to be more oppositional. That's a default. And I defer more to a relational way of talking to folks, whether it's my family, somebody close to me, or a new friend that I just made at the coffee shop. So that all fed into why I started talking politics and religion without killing each other. I knew from 2016 forward that it wasn't getting any better. In fact, it was getting worse. And when we started it in late 2020, I'm so glad because I've learned a ton, and on an individual basis, I feel like we've made a little bit of progress, not on a mass scale, but just for me, I've learned a lot more about it. And the folks I've had conversations with, we've all learned about it together.
Well, yeah, I mean, I live in New York, so I'm just outside of New York City. You're in another part of the country over in California, and both places are very interesting. You have a lot of different viewpoints on things, but it is fascinating to be in a place, for me personally, where the people around me mostly disagree with me, most importantly or primarily on theology, and then outside of that, on a lot of social issues, maybe political issues, I don't necessarily agree with the culture around me. And when you're in that environment, you have a couple of choices you can make. You could either hate everybody and have no friendships or relationships, or you could say, how am I going to be relational with people and get along with people and find ways to love others and engage? Because if we're Christians, our primary goal should be reaching people for the gospel, right? That should be our primary goal. And then, loving people in that process. So let's just go back to your story for a minute, though, because there's a lot there. You grew up, as you said, you were an observant Jew. What was it for you that convinced you that Christianity was the answer?
The short answer is Jesus. That's the shortest answer I could give. A little bit of a longer answer is I had some friends that one in particular I considered a mentor, and he was mentoring me in these other domains in business. Lisa and I were planning to have kids, so he was prepping me and coaching me up about being a good dad, good husband. But he was a Christian, and he was like all the books that he was giving me were these what I call Jesus books. So eventually, it came to a head. I said, "Look, Hal, I'm not into your whole Jesus thing. So let's explore these other topics, but like I don't want to have anything to do with that, especially growing up Jewish in the Northeast. I grew up in my family's all from New York. I grew up on the Jersey side. um, we're averse to proselytization. So I was making that clear to him, but he wisely just started with one little book that I read in about 2 hours. It was called More Than a Carpenter, the Josh McDowell book, the
I knew
intro
you were
to
going to
his
say
work.
that, by the way. I knew you were going to say that was the
Yeah,
book.
it makes sense. Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel, those were a couple of intros to, hey, there's this thing, and I found that book. I didn't find it convincing. I found it pissed me off, frankly. But it was at least the first time I saw someone try to make an empirical case for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the historical character of Jesus. So what it did was it prompted me into a very serious inquiry. And that summer, the spring, summer, early fall of 2000, I was reading voraciously. I was getting his bigger books, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I was getting some of Strobel's work. It also opened up to like an intro to Christian theology. So C.S. Lewis, is C.S. Lewis Mere
Yes.
Christianity?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
I was introduced to N.T. Wright at that point, and that's what I found compelling. I was still finding art when I was reading Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I was like, nope, nope, nope. This is, I came at it with an argumentative disposition. When I started reading C.S. Lewis, N.T. Wright, even John Howard Yoder, some pretty heady stuff, that I found much more compelling. And finally, I read the New Testament. That all took me to the New Testament.
Mm.
It cleared the brush, if you will, so that I could approach the cross symbolically. And the first book I read was James, and that was a good one for me. Divine Intervention, because it starts with to the 12 tribes, and like, oh, hey, that's me. How you doing? It also dealt with some of the issues that I was grappling with theologically, faith versus works, and that sort of thing. And then I went to Matthew 1, and within about 15 minutes, I got to where Jesus was giving what I recognized as a Devar Torah, which is what Jew in the Jewish tradition you read from the Torah 3 times a week, and when you read from the Torah a portion, the rabbi gives a Devar Torah, an explanation of what you had just read, and you talk about it. So Jesus was talking about Torah. It was the Sermon on the Mount. It was Matthew 5, and I just thought it was the most brilliant Devar Torah I'd ever heard. So for just to clarify, in Judaism, we read from the Torah typically 3 times a week, and whenever we read from the Torah, the rabbi conducts a Devar Torah, like an explanation of what we had just read, and we discuss it. The people in the minyan in the gathering, we discuss it. What I got to, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, I didn't know it was a Sermon on the Mount. I just recognized it as the most brilliant Devar Torah I'd ever read. And that pulled me in. I just kept on reading the collection, the New Testament, and I got to Revelation 21 and 22, and I recognized the parallels with Genesis 1 and 2, and it just by that point it all came together for me. It was the most cohesive. A lot of the existential questions I was asking, by the time I got to Revelation 22, it was just the most coherent set of answers to existential questions. Not that I had all the answers, because every answer that you arrive at, it opens up a whole bunch of new questions. But it it gave me a foothold to at least pray that prayer. To at
Yeah.
least just talk to God and be like, God, I don't have it all figured out, but there's something here, and can you help me out? It was
Yeah.
such a
Yeah.
clumsy prayer, but I did the best I could. And I woke up the next morning, and Lisa and I were driving, and I said, Lisa, I think I'm a Christian. I prayed a prayer, and God didn't strike me down when I prayed it. So I think I'm a Christian. And she grew up going to church. Her granny like scrubbing behind her ears and dragging her to church. She said, "If you think I'm going to church with you, you got another thing coming."
Did she end up going with you later?
She did, and then she gave her life to the Lord and did the whole Duncan thing, and so we raised our kids in the church. So there is we came together, but growing up and continue to ask questions. We both have that. It's a journey. It's not a destination. It's definitely a journey.
Yeah, it's an ongoing relationship. It's not this idea of you've said this prayer to accept Jesus and it's done. And I think a lot of people do approach it that way. They put so much emphasis on that initial entranceway in.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, it's a slow process too. They don't just have this overnight life change. Some people do. I mean, there are addicts who are, they say the prayer and their life has changed, and then they go into that relationship. But for a lot of people, it takes time, and it's different for each person. But that story is really, really interesting to me, just going from a practicing, Jewish person into being a Christian. And now you're in this really interesting realm because there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of infighting within and among churches and Christians today over a lot of different issues, politics being one of those big issues. That's not a new problem, but I think it's intensified in the last 4 to 8 years to a point. I mean, even with COVID, that was really difficult for a lot of pastors. I've talked to a lot of pastors who struggled to manage the debate and infighting that's been going on. What do you think is driving that? Why do you think there is so much division? Again, not new, but increasing.
Yeah, so I think it's a long story. And I am just a part of it and observing it, trying to understand it just like you. What I've noticed is there are a couple of ingredients that are either more exacerbated or are relatively new. One ingredient that I've noticed is the oppositional nature, an extreme oppositional nature that they are trying to do something to us. Therefore, we need to retrench and make sure that we protect us, our team, in a way. That we see those who we're hearing this mythology, these slogans. The war on Christmas is a silly one, but a good example of what they are trying to do to us, right? So it forces us into a fighting stance, and then in a way that becomes our idol, as opposed to gazing on God. We're gazing on the opposition and obsessed with the opposition and what we have to do to fight the opposition. So there is something to that. That's why that silly story about Pastor Tom and the Carrie Edwards bumper sticker is funny, but in a way it's not. It was kind of scary. So I think there's that. I think also there's a new kind of fundamentalism, and that sometimes fundamentalism is good. It gives us a clear structure. It gives us boundaries within which we can explore our faith. But there is also a ferocity and a certainty to fundamentalism that doesn't necessarily. It's not merited. So, I live in Santa Clarita, California, where John MacArthur's university and Grace Community is just on the other side of the hill. So a lot of the folks here in town, in Santa Clarita, it's John MacArthur territory. So John MacArthur, for those who don't know, he's very adamant about 6-day literal creation, 24-hour, per day kind of a thing. People would call him a literalist. I've had conversations with my buddies in Bible studies and elsewhere about the idea of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And I just thought, man, I know my people, and imagine us at the foot of Mount Sinai, and we hear God's voice, and he gets to the part where God's voice says a day. I can guarantee you that those 2 million or so people, not a single one of them said, I wonder if he means a literal 24-hour day. As a funny way of saying, like, look, man, if we're focused on the day and how long it is, we're missing a lot of Genesis 1 and 2, guys. But there's a certainty to that, and I can't penetrate through that certainty, nor can I penetrate through a ferocity. So that sets up a bunch of barriers to being able to loving our neighbor as ourselves.
Yeah,
because they're watching. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, I was going to say it's interesting because and push back on me because I love these conversations. Here we are, we're going to have an interesting conversation here. I think too, I think there's a balance. When it comes to having these battles and these fights, the problem I often observe, as somebody who has been on the talking head side of things a lot in the past and even now, but in controlled settings that I can control. I think we sometimes put other things before our faith, right? And so when you start to put politics or the obsession with winning above other people and love for other people and getting the gospel to them, you have a real problem. And that's the problem we have with politics oftentimes, is that because, and I would say, I do think the secular side, obviously, this has happened since the beginning of time. We see it throughout the Bible. The secular side is not going to love what Christians believe. We can't expect them to. And there are things that happen that we do need to stand up and say, hey, you know what, in a loving way, we don't agree with this. We don't think this is right. Or maybe engage in conversations that lead to that. I think there's a middle ground that we're somehow missing because of the things you're describing, right? That this tension is making people react, and we're not always reacting with the right priorities. And so that's the struggle, though, between truth and love, I think, and different sides maybe weigh one more than the other instead of finding the balance. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
yeah, so a lot of times we fall into the trap of thinking generally as opposed to personally. I think that when we think that this is what they think, whatever data point we assign to them, I can't handle that. I don't know what to do with that. But I know what to do with Angel, my neighbor. I know what to do with Pierino, my other neighbor. I gave him nicknames. One guy's from Italy. His name's Pete, but it's Pierino. So, but that's an indicator of I am relating to them on their terms as a human being and their unique story. I can work with that. I can work with Pete because I know he's from Italy. He's got this fascinating story. He had a restaurant, and now he walks his dog Bella every day, and his wife makes the best, just the best desserts. I can work with that. Whatever disagreements we might have about politics and where he gets his news source from, we have a connection because he's not just that guy who watches that channel. He's Pete. He's my buddy. So,
and that's how it should be, right? I mean, that's how it should be. I mean, you look at the Trump dynamic. I mean, let's just talk about it, right? The Trump dynamic, and I often find myself in arguments with people on both sides of this because you have the people who will say all the Trump supporters are ... And I find myself saying to them, well, look, there are a lot of legitimate issues, right? Regardless of what we think about who Trump is as a person, there are a lot of legitimate issues that the secular side, that the left have pushed in on the right. And on the flip side, when I'm talking to people on the right, you find yourself saying, well, you can't, especially Christians, we shouldn't be excusing bad behavior or bad policies or things that are being said simply because you feel like the other side is so bad, right?
Yeah.
So that's the tension point. I think a lot of Christians are stuck in the middle, and you're speaking about being relational one-on-one with people, elevating that above the issues or the things, right? I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so I've gotten myself kicked out of a few Bible studies, and Trump, the subject of Trump came up, which has gotten me kicked out because we can open up practically any page of the Bible, and it testifies against the words, actions, and character of Donald Trump. But here's the thing. This is what I noticed. You learn a lot more from your L's than you do from your W's. So I joke around about getting kicked out of Bible studies, and I can wear it as a trophy, but really, that's an L for me. That means there was some sort of a breakdown in the conversation and a breakdown in the relationship. So I learned from that. What did I learn? I learned that sometimes when when we're talking about Trump, and I'm criticizing, and let's look at the fruit of the Spirit, or what is love? Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does there's any number of texts that we can go anywhere in the Bible that we can go to and talk about it. But some of my friends think, whether they're conscious of it or not, they think I'm talking about them. They take it personally, like you're attacking me. I do it too. Like if somebody I'm not a liberal, I'm a fiscal conservative, socially libertarian, politically. But when people are talking about the libs, the libtards, the progressive, the left, that's my family. Those are my friends. Those are my homies, So I take it personally. Like you're talking about my friends and you don't know who they are. And I come to a defensive stance with that because I'm protecting I'm protecting my turf, as opposed to understand, hey, listen, I'm not talking about you. Let's talk about Trump's character. Okay, do you want to talk about Trump's character? First, let's talk about, is that important to us, right? Oh, you want to talk about it? Okay, great. Let's talk about his policies. To me, the character is still important because, for example, Israel, I'm a Jew, right? So Israel's important. Okay, let's talk about it. Oh, he was the best thing to Israel since, I don't know, David and Solomon built the tent. I say, hold on. I have a hard time embracing the guy that bear hugs, the Unite the Right, Jews will not replace us guy. So I have a hard time there saying that he was the best thing. And by the way, the U.S. has been the best friend of Israel since at least 1946. So, but at least now we're talking substantively, right?
Well,
we're not talking, right.
Well, I mean, it's so complicated, and I know I'll probably get myself in trouble, but I'm just going to say what I'm thinking here. My thought on all of this, and maybe this is the challenge here, right? You have somebody, I mean, Trump is really an oxymoron in so many different ways because the character is not great, and yet people will pretend it is, right? I don't know why people can't get to a place of saying, and this is kind of where I am. This person has consistently shown not good character, does not have Christian fruit, is not somebody, and look, I can only judge based on fruit. I can only hope that people's hearts align with Christ, and at some point you see the fruit of that, and that happens for everybody. But this is what I'm seeing. I can also say, yeah, the confusing part is that a lot of the policies, not all of them, but a lot of them are things that are not bad, right? And that, in fact, maybe some people are saying, hey, I was faring better under Trump than I am now. And that's a whole other conversation about why that is. But the reality is you have a very complex figure, and you have people unwilling on both sides to acknowledge that there are complexities there that you should be able to. I mean, whenever I've criticized, the pushback I've gotten has been horrific. You're a horrible liberal. I'm a conservative in every way. Okay, so that's just who I am. That's who I've always been. I'm conservative on almost every issue, right? But you become this thing when you don't agree, to your point, 100%. And that's not a healthy thing for Christians or really for anybody in this country, to be putting people in boxes based on bizarre categories.
Yeah. I think the key is doing better at having healthier conversations in the first place. So when we find, like, many of us, including me, have this tendency to take a competitive disposition, a competitive posture, to start lining up all of the retorts that we're going to have when somebody says something. But, if I can train myself to have a more curious posture. So the question, I like his policies. Oh, interesting. What policies? Not as a way to like catch them. My job is not to, to put them under the spotlight and to interrogate them. Oh, interesting. What policies? With the hopes of getting to the other side of that answer and saying, I never thought of that. If you have the possibility in a conversation of getting to what Monica Guzman calls the I never thought of it that way moment, I never thought of it that way. I never thought of that. That's interesting. I'll put some thought to that. That's a good posture to enter into a conversation, because it leaves, from a gospel standpoint, it leaves room for the possibility that you're nurturing a relationship, and a relationship is much better ground to be able to get to say, hey, what would you read this book? Would you read this more than a Carpenter book? Would you consider reading James? Would you consider?
There's two things here in this conversation that I want people to take away. At the end of the day, the most important thing from a Christian perspective is that people find the truth. And one of the challenging things for me, and I've spent my career talking and debating with people, right? And always trying to find a way to do it in a way where I'm leaving not hating the person, which is the whole point of your podcast, right? But that we should, if we're doing something that is going to push people away from Jesus, then I think we need to second guess what we're doing or saying, right? Because if that's our end goal and I'm saying something, so there are even people, and maybe this is unhealthy, I don't know, I'd love your take, but there are even people who I've pulled back from talking about these issues with, because I know that they struggle to talk about it in a rational way. I don't, but that even having the conversation will cloud their vision of what it means to be a Christian. Because if I say anything favorable at all on any sort of issue about not necessarily Trump, but Republicans or whatever, that's going to cloud it and make it difficult for them. And I'd much rather see them accept Jesus. Now, not that I would never speak to them about it, but I've pulled back a little bit So I don't know. What is your take on that? Are there times that we need to pull back maybe in those relationships on certain topics?
Yeah. So I asking me to stop talking about politics and religion is like amputating a limb. You
Same,
render me
same.
mute. but
Yes.
but a brilliant guy that I was fortunate to have a conversation with recently, brilliant conservative thinker named Yuval Levin, talked actually right after October 7th, and he was born in Haifa in Israel. He said, sometimes you just have to get to the point of saying, I really strongly disagree with you. Now pass the gravy. We were talking about, having to face our relatives at Thanksgiving. That I just really strongly disagree. Pass the gravy. So sometimes you can get to that point because another brilliant philosopher, Bob Costas, Robert Costa is the journalist. Bob Costas is the baseball sports journalist. He said, when I couldn't talk about anything else with my father, I could still talk about baseball. So you being in New York, we could still talk about baseball. Unless you're a Yankee fan, then there's no talking to you. Then there's we're done. No, just kidding.
I love that. I think so. October 7th, abortion, the transgender kids issue, right? We'll get more specific. These are issues for people on both sides that. And I think in particular, let's talk about October 7th. You have scenarios that you're looking at extreme evil. And I do think for me, one thing that has helped is to recognize, and I don't mean this in a diminishing capacity, and I want you to push back if you don't agree, but from a spiritual perspective, I think a lot about Ephesians 6. We're in this battle between good and evil, and we get so consumed with the me versus you and all of that. When I see something like October 7th, it is true evil. I can call it out for what it is, and I can recognize that obviously there's personal responsibility for free will, but at the same time, there is evil that drives a lot of what is going on in our world today. And that helps me have a little bit more prayerfulness, a little bit more compassion, but also a little bit more resoluteness to be praying against those things. So I guess my point is, there are times where things are just so, like, I have a very difficult time when I'm talking to people who are excusing or ignoring what happened on October 7th. That is a real struggle for me, right? So what do you do in those kinds of situations when you're really looking at true evil?
So if you look at the story of the Bible, you look at all of these empires, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans even, they're not around. Those with military might that fought, and had such great power are no longer around. But who's still around? The people of the word, Jewish people are still around. So I might be making more of this than is appropriate. And I'd love to talk to both a rabbi as well as a learned Christian theologian about it. But I don't think that what Bibi Netanyahu is doing is going to win the day in the long term. Nor do I think Hamas or, God forbid, Hezbollah or these terrorist groups are going to win the day. You know who's going to win So I have cousins there. And one of my cousins told me a similar story, actually. I saw something very, very similar on CBS Sunday morning. And so she does infrastructure, basically. So she was building sewage systems. And she said, they grew up with Palestinian neighbors, some Bedouins, some Muslims, some, different Christian Palestinians. And in a new development, she had to partner with one of her Palestinian neighbors to build the sewage systems. And they became really good friends. And she said, what's going to save us? Not winning a war. Poop is going to save us. We had to collaborate. We had to get it figured out across our differences, religious and ethnic and all this stuff. Because at the end of the day, we had to figure out where the poop goes. Poop is going to save us. But the serious point is, on an individual level, a relationship level, figuring out how to live well among each other, the necessities of eating and clothing ourselves and where the poop goes. That is going to win the day. Not some war that we abolish and flatten our enemies. That's just, I don't know. We can look at the Bible and the trajectory forward. That's what I'm taking my sense of maybe a remnant of hope from.
Well, and I think, look, we know how the story ends, and people have different theologies about what they think on the end of days, but we know how the story ends. We know what Revelation tells us. We know about the new heaven and the new earth and all of that from a Christian perspective. So, our job, I think, is, yeah, there are going to be wars and there are going to be things that happen. Scripture says that, right? There are signs that we will see. But I think keeping our eye on the prize, our eye on the focus, right, of, okay, we're here to reach people. Like, if you think the end of days are coming, and I'm not saying they are, I guess we're always marching toward them. But if you really believe that, then the most pressing thing on your heart should be, how do I reach people with the gospel, right? That should be the message that we're all sort of marching toward, not getting obsessed with all these different, infighting and politics and all that. Not that it doesn't matter, not that we can't have opinions on it. I think that is all great, but we need to refocus ourselves. And I think a big piece of that, loving God, right, and loving others, and part of that is bringing God to others. And so I'll give you the final word before before we check out here, but I've loved this conversation.
Yeah, if we can just remember, there's a lot of takeaways that you've reminded me of, but the one that again you've just reminded me of is Imago Dei, the God within us, the image of God in each of us. And the second that I see that I other someone to the extent that I can no longer not just see the God in them, but I can't even see their humanity, that they're just a data point for me, then I've lost something. I've dehumanized myself in that process. But if I can see the God, even in someone that I strongly disagree with, even in Yankee fans, then we'll be able to do some work together. We'll be able to have a cup of coffee or a beer or whatever your preference is, and we'll be able to have these, get to the point where if we could talk about baseball, maybe we could talk about religion, maybe we could talk about politics, and do some good work together.
Well, I love this conversation. The podcast is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Is there a place you want to send people to in particular to learn more about you and the show?
I appreciate that. Yeah, the easiest way to find us is www.politicsandreligion.us. So the end is spelled out, www.politicsandreligion.us. Or you can find me on all the socials at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E, S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan.
I love it. Thanks so much for your time today.
I appreciate it, Billy. It was great talking to you. I hope it's not the last time we hang out. It's been fun.
That's all for today's Higher Ground. Make sure you tune in next week for another episode. In the meantime, head over to WashingtonTimes.com. Be sure to read the news there and go to the Higher Ground vertical where you can get podcasts, news, opinion pieces, and so much more. It's all about faith, culture, and the world in which we live. We'll see you again for more Higher Ground next week.